So it's lovely to be with you once again for our online book group on Walter Hilton. This week we're looking at chapters 77 to the end of book one. I have to say, I was thinking about this. I first read this book, gosh, it must have been about 30 years now, and I haven't actually returned to it since. That's a disgrace, isn't it? But I hope you're having as much fun reading it again, because we often have these books on the bookshelf and say, "Oh, I must read that," and then we never quite get around to reading it. So it's a real pleasure to be able to read this together. So thank you for the opportunity of getting me to read it again. I suppose it's because why I say all that. Well, because I think the end of the first book has that delightful paragraph written by, it's all written by, but particularly showing Walter Hilton the person, where he says, take what I say, I don't usually manage to do it, but take what you can, and if it's of use to you, then if it takes you into God, then that's good. But if it doesn't, then do something that will. And it's lovely sort of exchange with his contemplative to whom he's writing. But it's a lovely exchange between an author and a reader. So it's a really lovely ending to a to the first book. So what want to have a look at tonight, though, is those slightly enigmatic words that he says at the end that always gets me really puzzling. So he's just given us this amazing treatise about the spiritual life, about how we are to cope with this image of sin, and how we are to begin to reform the soul to be in the image and likeness of Christ. And he's written a text which only at places does it feel like he's talking to someone who's enclosed in an anchoritic life. The rest of it could be for anybody in their in their Christian life. And I guess that's why it became so popular, because it doesn't read as if it's for an elite class of spiritual people. It's as if it feels like it's written and relevant to everyone. And I guess that's why when we read it today, it feels even relevant to us, because the kind of things that he's talking about, you know, how do you stop yourself being really envious, and what's the root of pride, and how do you nip it in the bud, and all those kind of things, and what do we long for, and how is our sight of Christ so clouded by this darkness that we can't see through sometimes. All of that, it's universal, and it goes across different classes and across different nations, as we are tonight, but it also goes through time. So the bit that really always perplexes me is right at the end of this. He says, "Lastly, what I have written does not apply to anyone living the active life, but only to you and others who live the contemplative life." That's me. That always reads, as someone who is very involved in doing things, well, probably a bit too much in doing things. It feels like an absolute slap in the face. Um, well, how can you say this when you've just written this great book that's going to help me, that suddenly everything you've written is not for someone like myself who's living in the world as it is? So it makes me begin to wonder, how is he actually using this statement? Is he actually using this word contemplative in the same way as we understand it today? Because if you go to Google and you Google in, there are tons of places where you can see how to live a contemplative life within an active lifestyle, you know, within the world, basically. And you don't have to be enclosed within the four walls of an anchor hold to actually be able to live this life. So there must be, so for many people today, it doesn't seem to be incongruous that you can actually marry the two together. And we ourselves have even been reflecting in this book group about just how much he seems to be touching on what's known as the mixed life, the person who lives a kind of in the world, but also is governed by the hopes, by the disciplines, by the spiritual guidance of the contemplative. So how is he using this word contemplative at this point in the book that might be different? We've come to understand it today, but also how he may have been using it in the rest of his text. So that's what I want to look at and think about. I want to start by thinking about where is it in these chapters does he seem to be writing specifically to people who are in an anchor hold? So that would be an anchoress or an anchorite. Where does he seem to be actually saying, you know, for you, in your situation, this is what you need to think about? Well, there's a couple of really clear places, and both of them are to do with the practicalities of living the contemplative enclosed life. The first one we see in chapter 78, and that's when he starts to talk about the five bodily senses and how the five are like windows to the soul. And he tells the anchoress, the anchorite, the contemplative, that she has to shut off these windows to stop sin coming into the soul, but also that she has to make sure that she doesn't go out seeking within the pleasures of this world something because she can't actually feel and know God within her. So in that kind of the difficulties of the spiritual life within, to actually go outwards and find that need met by the pleasures of this world. So he says the word, so you must close and shutter these windows. Now, reading that, it seems to me it's an absolute sort of resonates with how anchorites lived at the time. We have this great 13th century book called the Ancre Novissa, or the Guide for Anchoresses, which gives us a really good idea of not only how an anchoress is advised to live her inner life, but also how she's actually to order her outer life. So what's she to do with, how does she pray? How does she dress? Does she have a cat? Sadly, she's allowed a cat, but not a cow. All these different things. Don't wear a hedgehog shirt, because that's not a good idea. You can wear a rough shirt, but don't use hedgehogs. It's amazing little details it has in it. But one of the things that he really goes into, known as the outer senses. Okay, so in the second part of that book, there's a whole section about how to manage your outer life, and it's really practical. And one of the things is all about the windows that are going to be on your anchor hold. One of the windows going to look into the church, so you can see the Eucharist, but the other one is to look outward, and that's known as the parlor window, which of course is very significant for the monastic tradition, the parlor, the place where you're allowed to speak. So the parlor window is a place where the anchoress is allowed to speak. And that is seen to have a cloth over it, a covering over it, which is black with a white cross. And the author of the Ancre Novissa says, my dear sisters, Love your windows as little as you possibly can. Let them all be little, the parlours the smallest and narrowest. And so he describes all this, and the blackness is to signify that the anchoress is covered in sin, like that black image, that lump that we were talking about in other chapters, but also that they've been burnt up by the love of Christ. And so they're annihilated from the world. And the white cross is the purity, their purity of living, but also the purity of their maidenhood. And so what the author of Ancre Novisa then goes on is talks all about the ways in which you can be tempted as an anchorite or an anchoress to go and spend too much time at your anchor hold window, the window. And he goes through a whole thing, which is about the senses. So talking too much, gossiping, even if it's holy gossip, listening too much, wanting to eat too much that you're given, all these kind of different things. And so when I was reading that about the 5 senses of windows and how you must shut them off, it immediately made me think, oh my goodness, that resonates with what the contemplative is actually experiencing in her life, in the sense of the windows of senses out into the world. But what's interesting is that in this text, Hilton isn't using the idea of senses, windows, in a literal sense. He's using it in a spiritual sense. So actually, in a way, you could argue, well, Hilton, I know this may refer back to the windows of the anchor hold, but it's as much relevant to me as it is to anyone else, because as we know, he goes on to say, doesn't he, about don't, if someone gossips, then just ignore what they say and all that kind of stuff. So there's another place where Hilton seems to be talking about the practical life of the contemplative, and it's really clear. It's probably the clearest, and that's in chapter 83, where it's actually entitled how a person vowed to the life of religion should conduct themselves towards visitors. And it resonates with the kind of advice and the warning of the Ancre Novisa that you'll find in that part too. But what's nice and different is that Hilton kind of softens it all. It's not like you're not allowed any conversation with anyone and you're completely cut off from the world. But instead, Hilton sort of says, no, you are allowed to talk to people. And even if you're interrupted in prayer, because the most important thing is that you are showing a reality of for your fellow person. So he takes it in a kind of different way. He doesn't make it quite as, but he makes it a kind of invitation then to know the reality of your love for another person. So, for example, when someone comes to speak to you, he says, don't be alone, keep them waiting, but be willing to speak as if the person is an angel. And he says a lot more about this in that little treatise that I mentioned many weeks ago, which is called The Mixed Life. So he touches on this insight in this chapter. And for me, I think, again, even though he may be referring to the religious life of the contemplative, if we put it that way, it's still a very helpful, very helpful insight that anyone could take with them into their life. So if he's not so much referring to the Ancre Novisa in the kind of practical elements within his book, what is he doing with this word
contemplative? How is he using it to be able to say at the end of this book that this book is only for contemplatives alone? Well, I had to put my thinking cap on here, and it seems to me that what's lying behind Hilton's words, it may resonate with some of the practicalities, but it seems more likely that it's his understanding of what contemplative means and how it had developed during the medieval period to describe a life wholly devoted to the love of God rather than any kind of activity. So he's not talking about something practical here. He's talking about something theoretical, which is then lived out in practice. So he's going back to the theory that makes people want to go into the anchor hold in the first place. And that is to be entirely and wholly devoted to the love of God. Now, this notion has its roots in Greek philosophy, where contemplative means looking at something, to contemplate, to study with the eyes or with the mind, which can be distinguished from that of doing things. Hence, the distinction made between what we know as contemplative time, that we're reading and thinking and sitting and not doing, but we're doing with our heads, with our hearts, and the active time when we're actually going out and doing things. Now, the Neoplatonists, who heavily influenced Christian mystical thought, maintained the superiority of contemplation over that of action, that the whole goal of life was the knowledge of and union with God. Actually, it goes back to that whole story of Mary and Martha. Mary has chosen the better part. Martha, who's busy doing things, is distracted, not able to give her whole attention to Christ. That's the theory, that's the scripture from which all of this comes. So Augustine maintained that there is a contemplative element, namely faith, and a practical element, namely morals, in every Christian life. So all of us, he says, has a bit of Mary and Martha within us, but he's also very doubtful of the propriety of a purely contemplative life. So it had already gone off, you see, people were trying to live, in the desert, wherever, and live this life wholly devoted to God and not have this practical element at all. And what Augustine is saying, well, hang on, let's get a bit of balance here. Both of these are needed within a Christian life. And actually, is it really helpful to just go off and, live wholly contemplative life? Do you not want to pair that up with action? Because, how you live out your faith is as important and how you are in your, with God, in your devotion to God. It has to show itself in action to people. So this balance. So that's why Augustine wasn't quite so sure about it. However, the notion that the contemplative life was other and apart from daily business was really influenced by someone called Pseudo-Dionysius. And he paired it up with the notion of the three ways or the three phases of the Christian life. The first being purgative, the second illuminative, and the third unitive. So it's this kind of journey back to God. And medieval interpreters connected this with the path of spiritual progress, from beginning with end of bad habits, eradication of bad habits, and the cultivation of the virtues. And I guess that's exactly what we've been seeing in Hilton's text so far about how do we get rid of that image of sin that is so warping our way of thinking? How do we purge ourselves of that bad habits? And the way you do that is by cultivating the virtues. And that's exactly what he's been talking about. And then secondly, we move into this illumination of the mind through meditation. And once again, Hilton's already started to touch on that. He's given us this idea that, you know, the way you move out of this kind of lump of sin is by replacing it with the image of Jesus Christ. So reforming yourself through meditation, but also through purging yourself of all that's bad, so that your mind can once more be illuminated with the light and the presence of Christ. And then finally, of course, we have the unitive phase, which is when a person is wholly devoted to the love of God. And that is seen, if you remember the cloud of unknowing, that is seen as love of God for God's sake, not love of God for your own sake. So there's a very careful little sort of twist of thought there that we have to take in. Now, if we go back to the beginning of book 1, all those moons ago, you'll remember that Hilton actually set out his criteria and understanding of the active and the contemplative life, if you remember that. And he gave it to us in theoretic terms. He told us that there is the active life, and that is where we can show love and charity, and it's shown inwardly, outwardly. And inwardly, it is all about purgation. So the first degree of contemplation he describes that as the knowledge of God. The second degree is seen as loving God, feelings of love and spiritual fervor. And this aligns with the illuminative stage. The lower stage of the second degree is all about grace in the active life and contemplation. But this can be very brief. The higher phase is only, he describes, for those who live in great peace of body and soul. So the highest stage of contemplation is seen as that when someone is wholly devoted to the love of God, that actually they've managed to get all the stuff that's going on inside them under control through the use of the virtues, through the virtues becoming habits themselves rather than bad habits, that they live in a state of kind of peace and security. That he sees as the second highest stage of contemplation. But then the third degree, he goes on, is about knowing and loving God perfectly. And of course, that's what we would equate with the unitive stage. Now, what's really interesting in this is that actually Hilton says that the active life, someone in the active life, can actually experience this unitive, this purgative, illuminative, and unitive stages throughout the time that they are living in their active life. He doesn't deny that. But what he does say is that only the solitary can know it, but possess it in all its fullness. If you're in the active life, these are just moments. They're moments of feeling united. There are moments of illumination. We have to go back and start grinding through the gauge and illumination, all of that once again. So it's like, if you live in the active life, it's much harder for us in this life to actually get away from all that stuff that weighs us down. But he says a solitary who's cut off from the world, they have much more chance to actually not be pulled back into the darkness of sin, the image of sin, that they are released from that, and that then they are able to not only have that unitive experience of God, but also to sit in that state of being for much, much longer, to have God in all his fullness. So that, it seems to me, is why right at the end, he leaves this tantalizing little word, that what I've written does not apply to anyone living the active life, but only to you and others who live the contemplative life. So, to my mind, he seems to give us a bit of a teaser. It's like, well, what do you mean? What are you saying? I wonder if that's why the contemplative, the woman who he's writing to, says, what are you talking about? You've got to write to me again. And hence, we have book 2. So that is my kind of little thoughts, reflections about these chapters. Farewell, have a good half-term week off, and we will be back in not next week, week after next, and then we're diving into book 2 for the first 9 chapters.